Hello everyone, for Telesur, I'm Cody Weddle in Caracas, Venezuela. We start in Mexico City. That's where tens of thousands of people are expected to gather shortly for a march to commemorate the state massacre of over 300 people during a student protest in 1968 in TLATLOLCO Square. Now this year's march will hold special significance as the marchers will also remember the 43 forcibly disappeared students from the AYOTZINAPA Teachers Training College. Now, in an apparent sign of concern that violence could erupt later in the day, security forces carried out unprecedented exercises simulating disturbances earlier this week. And our correspondent Clayton Kahn is following the marches for this anniversary, and he joins us live now. Hello, Clayton. This year, the homage there, it really has a special connotation because of the AYOTZINAPA case. It was precisely the AYOTZINAPA students were preparing to go to the Capitol to commemorate the other massacre when they were attacked. Is that right?
That is completely true.
And what else can you tell us about these marches that are planned, Clayton?
Well, Cody, it's really interesting. With the 47 years have passed, many here in Mexico say that very little has changed. It's really important to understand that in the 1968 student massacre, Mexico was ruled by one party, the Institutional Revolutionary Party, or PRI, which was not very tolerant of dissent or even other freedoms such as the press. Now, although the PRI lost in the year 2000, ending 71 years of rule, it has come back with the current administration of Enrique Peña Nieto, and social and civil organizations, rights organizations have denounced this administration specifically for going after the press and dissent. Now, one thing that's really important to also note is that both the survivors and families of victims in the 1968 student massacre and survivors and families of victims of AYOTZINAPA point to two elements that are very, very similar from both incidents. That you had security forces, whether that be the police or the military, carry out extrajudicial murders, as well as the forced disappearance, as well as illegal organizations. In the case of the 68 student massacre, you had a paramilitary organization that participated in the massacre that was aligned with the government. And in AYOTZINAPA, you had organized crime members. Now, the thread that has sort of connected these two, that the families say, is impunity. Now, in 68, not one of those responsible has actually faced jail time. And as we know with the AYOTZINAPA case, 111 people have been detained, but not one of them is facing formal charges of forced disappearance or extrajudicial murders.
And Clayton, we're hearing about what's been called the tremendous deployment of security forces this year around the commemoration. So what are the chances we might expect some unusual violence there in the marches?
Well, it's interesting. Earlier this week, Mexico City riot police were performing exercises in the historic center, the area where the march is to pass later today. But earlier today, Mexico City authorities, as well as the federal police, announced that they were not going to deploy those riot police. In previous years, when they deployed riot police, tensions have risen, usually violence breaks out. But the organizers of this year's march, the 68 committee, who are actually survivors of the 1968 student massacre, have pleaded with the authorities, have called the authorities, and have called their own organizations and other organizations, student organizations, social organizations, and social society and civil society as a whole, to not fall into provocations and to not provoke violence. And so Mexican authorities, Mexico City authorities, have said that only 1,800 transit police will be deployed, and that they will not provoke any violent incidents, and they will be monitoring the march via sort of a closed camera system. Now, it's also really important to note that in previous years, provocations have been occurred due to police dressed as civilians.
All right, interesting points there. Thanks for the latest. Clayton Kahn reporting from Mexico. Clayton, thanks.
Thanks, Corey.
Moving on now, we go to South America. That's where Colombia and Venezuela continue their talks today over the border crisis. Now, the defense ministers of the two countries are meeting this Friday in the Colombian city of Santa Marta, a month and a half after Venezuela closed its border to prevent smuggling and paramilitary activity. Now, this is the second ministers' meeting after the agreement signed by Presidents Nicolás Maduro and Juan Manuel Santos aimed at building a new border of peace. In Colombia, the FARC's leader, Timeleon Jimenez, known as Timochenko, has ordered the guerrilla group to stop combat training and focus on political and cultural education instead. Now, Timochenko announced this in a tweet addressed to the president of Colombia, Juan Manuel Santos, in which he said the following, quote, Juan Manuel Santos, I've ordered the structures of the FARC EP to suspend military courses and dedicate themselves to political and cultural formation, end quote. Now, it was the rebel leader's first tweet in nearly 3 years. And President Santos has accused former President of Colombia, Álvaro Uribe, of purposely fomenting fear among Colombians about the peace deal. At Columbia University in New York, Santos said that Uribe's opposition to the peace process is driven out of political interests. He added that, quote, Mr. Uribe does not support the peace process because he lives from manipulating fear, and war is the best environment to generate fear, end quote. Indigenous organizations of Colombia and different lawmakers have gathered to bring attention to the conditions of extreme vulnerability that indigenous children are living under in different and various states across the country. Our correspondent Natalia Margarita now reports from Bogotá.
En nuestros territorios.
A world where we can live in harmony with the Mother Earth. That's what indigenous Colombian Sofia called for as lawmakers released frightening figures on indigenous children. 70% are suffering from malnutrition and 60% live under poverty, a reality that contrasts with Colombia's president's discourse at the recent UN Sustainable Development Summit.
We just wonder, how come we can speak about peace and about development in our country when we have some of our children literally dying of starvation, when we do not have access to any long-term projects that can possibly guarantee sustainability for our indigenous peoples in Colombia?
Right in the border with Venezuela, in the department of Guajira, is where indigenous children have starved to death. Some local leaders talk about 5,000 dead, while the government has acknowledged some 300. But beyond numbers is a fact that children are dying from malnutrition in a region where mining multinationals have promised to bring development.
This does not have any possible explanation. We simply don't understand why children have to die in a state which has lots of money. The state of Guajira receives big payments for royalties, and children continue to die even though there are economic resources available.
The government has said that with peace will come better social conditions. For indigenous leaders, however, the precarious living conditions have more to do with the state abandonment than directly with the armed conflict.
That's not the way to construct peace, even less sustainable development. The government continues to privilege the interest of multinational companies, placing those economic interests above those of the citizens, above the interest of the victims, those of us who have been stripped of our lands and continue to be victims of this economic model.
The indigenous communities have also denounced that instead of the very much needed state care, what they have been receiving from the government is a stigmatization and criminalization of their leaders, the very same people who are fighting for peace but with social justice. Natalia Margarita, Telesur, Bogotá.
Elsewhere around Latin America, the president of Brazil, Dilma Rousseff, has announced she will cut up to 10 ministers out of the current 39 to reduce costs. Now, this one day after she announced a reshuffling of her cabinet. The country is in the midst of its worst economic recession in decades, and experts expect its economy to shrink 2.8% this year and inflation to rise to 9.46%. The planning minister is expected to inform about the scope of the proposal next week. He said that the move will save hundreds of millions of reals. And outside the Brazilian Congress, a 12-meter high duck was placed by Sao Paulo industrial unions as part of a protest over tax increases. Now they demand the government to cut spending instead. The campaign was launched on September 21st and aims to hand a petition to Congress. When it reaches 1 million signatures by Thursday evening, the petition had achieved over 474,000 signatures. After 5 days of protests against a mining project that ended with 4 people killed by police, demonstrators in the Peruvian region of Apurimac have stopped their strike for 48 hours. However, the protests do continue. Now, the miners and farmers halted the strike for a dialogue. According to the region's governor, President Ollanta is willing to dialogue and has convoked his ministers. A state of emergency was declared on Tuesday as residents demand a halt to the expansion of the copper mine of Las Bambas and justice for those who have been killed. And still in Peru, where a children's book is becoming part of the struggle for LGBTI rights. Our correspondent in Lima now explains.
Camila Has Two Mothers is the title of Veronica Ferrari's first book for children, which narrates the story of a child who faces for the first time at school questions of why she has parents of the same sex. The book teaches children with a positive tone how to deal with such situation, but is also meant as a tool for parents as it provides tips on how to respond to similar situations.
In a way, my life is reflected here, my life at some specific moments, and the goal of the books is also to prevent my daughter and many boys and girls from experiencing what we went through, so that in 10 years, nobody has to live that or fight, and that this becomes something common and usual. But since for the moment it is not something common and usual, we have to do what we do. We have to fight and empower the children.
LGBTI activists like Ferrari believe it should be a right to be offered reading options that go beyond what is said by conservative or religious patterns. However, Liurka Otsuka from the Center of Promotion of Sexual and Reproductive Rights explains little protections exist under the law for the LGBTI community.
We don't have any public policy to talk specifically about the violence and the discrimination for these vulnerable groups. And on the other hand, in relation to the family or recognition of civil and political rights, for example, up to today there is no legal category or legal formula that recognizes families made up of same-sex couples.
Fórmula jurídica que reconozca a las familias conformadas por parejas del mismo sexo.
Although the movement in support of a civil union failed to get the law passed in 2015, it produced the largest mobilizations in support of LGBTI rights in the history of the country. With such growing numbers, it is expected that sooner or later Peru will follow the steps to protect the LGBTI community that most of Latin America is already taking. Rael Mora, Telesur, Peru.
The El Niño phenomenon is already causing damage in Guatemala, where authorities have warned that the country faces a disaster of huge proportions due to the heavy rains that have caused floods and mudslides. We're joined now by our correspondent, Gerardo Torres. Hello, Gerardo. What's the latest there?
Hello, Cody. As you said, the landslide produced by the rains in the municipality of Santa Catarina Timula, that is about 12 kilometers from the capital of Guatemala. The rescue task has stopped because of the constant rain. They're expecting to start soon, looking for more people. Yesterday, they reported 4 people that were found dead because of the landslide. They evacuated at least 50 people, but there are still 300 people that are disappeared. The rescue operation will continue now. Some of the families continue during the morning and during all night, even though the authorities said they were dangerous. They were looking for their family members. They're still looking, and now the authorities will be part of this rescue operation again.
Now quickly, Gerardo, the forecast there says it's still going to keep raining there for at least 2 more weeks. So how are people preparing for that, the chance for even more rain?
Well, the thing is that constant rain in all the region have affected mainly the more poor families and the more vulnerable communities. The community of El Cambrai too were mainly of poor houses. The government has declared an alert, a red and orange alert, depending in the places. But people, what the government has said is that if the rescue teams go to the communities and ask people to evacuate, they have to do it immediately. Some of the people they don't want to do it because, well, they have their houses and all the things. But there's a lot of vulnerability in many of the cases. Right now, it's supposed to continue, and the rescue teams have assured that they are prepared to evacuate and to rescue people if it's needed.
All right, Gerardo, well, we certainly hope that those rains will eventually subside there. Gerardo Torres, thank you.
Thank you.
Moving on now, we go to South America, where Argentinians are only 1 month away from going to the polls and to vote for their next president. The Front for Victory coalition, which seeks a new term through its candidate Daniel Scioli, is busily campaigning for its economic policy, which they say promises progressive measures.
The economic policy of the ruling Front for Victory coalition for Argentina's next presidential term, which it will contest at the polls on October 25 through its candidate Daniel Scioli, aims to attract more foreign investment, significantly lower unregistered labour, stimulate banks to offer mortgages and reduce the rate of inflation to a single digit.
There are increasing opportunities for private and public investment, and though we will gradually achieve single-digit inflation, but never through measures of austerity, never at the expense of social inclusion policies, and never at the expense of wages, we will achieve it through more and better growth.
It has also promised the full refund of value-added tax to all pensioners who make credit or debit card purchases.
Anything that has to do with tax reform, while maintaining the level of financing that the state requires through taxation, but modifying those taxes that strongly affect those in low socioeconomic sectors. Shifting taxation onto high-income earners is one of the big challenges ahead.
If re-elected, the Front for Victory has announced that it will rise public investment in science and technology from 0.6 to 1% of its GDP.
For the era ahead of us, putting science and technology on center stage is key towards the improvement of systematic competitiveness of the economy.
The Front for Victory has also confirmed that its stance on exchange rate policy will continue to be completely antagonistic to the policy which the neoliberal bloc has through its two presidential candidates, Mauricio Macri of the Cambiemos coalition and Sergio Massa of UNA. If the Front for Victory is re-elected, it has announced that the exchange rate will continue to be regulated by the Argentine Central Bank and not by the marketplace. Leo Polete-Gouti, Telesur, Buenos Aires.
Around the world now, Western leaders are demanding Russia stop its airstrikes within Syria. However, there's no sign of Russia slowing down those strikes. We'll have more after the break.
20 flights striking 8 Islamic State group targets in Syria. The Russian Ministry of Defense published
that have marked the course of history. Productions designed in the English language and made for the English-speaking world. This is Documentary. Watch it on telesur.net/English. Telesur, wherever the news, you'll be there.
Russia's airstrikes in Syria are on their third day with no sign of slowing down. And in a new development, Russia has admitted that they are also targeting non-Daesh groups, as activists have accused Russia of targeting civilians in areas under control of Western-backed rebels. Now, Thursday, U.S.-led coalition against Daesh called on Russia to cease its aerial campaign, which fell on deaf ears. As the rift on this matter grown, Vladimir Putin is meeting Western leaders for the first time since Moscow launched airstrikes in Syria. The leaders from the West have released a statement that Russia's actions would only fuel more extremism and radicalization. And Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov spoke during a press conference at the United Nations on Thursday, where he responded to criticism and said Russia was working toward the Common Security Council goal of defeating the Islamic State group. More now from our Syrian correspondent, Hazem Abdullah.
In the first day of raids, Russian Air Force jets have made a total of 20 flights, striking 8 Islamic State group targets in Syria. The Russian Ministry of Defense published videos of these strikes and targets.
The Russian Ministry of Defense has already provided the coordinates of its airstrikes and attached pictures and videos of targets, despite not being legally binded to do so. This has embarrassed the United States, which claims to be carrying out airstrikes against terrorism for more than 2 years. Yet there have never showed the targets or the nature of the strikes, and have not seen any results on the ground during that period. This confirms that the United States lied in claiming to carry out air operations against militants.
During a joint press conference Wednesday, U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry and Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov agreed to expedite the talks on Syria between the two countries in order to prevent any accident in the Syrian airspace. Analysts believe that this process is to prevent any clashes between the Russian and the Israeli air forces, the strongest ally of the United States in the region.
The U.S. fears are not real, but rather they are concerned on the Israeli security, and especially with the Russian presence in Syrian airspace, Israelis will lose the ability to fly and carry out airstrikes against the Syrian army, as they did in several times. Today, they can no longer do this.
The Russian Defense Ministry has revealed that 2 Russian warships crossed the Black Sea on the way to the Mediterranean. They will be used for the landing of special naval forces to protect Russian military equipment and weaponry in Syria. The ministry also announced that it will be exchanging military intelligence on Syria with Iranian and Iraqi forces. Hazem Abdullah, TV Syria.
Reports have surfaced that heavily armed Iranian forces have joined the war on the ground. The White House responded during a press conference saying that that would make the conflict worse.
I have seen those reports. We're aware of those reports and we're taking a look at them. I cannot independently confirm them, but if true, and the reports are coming from a variety of sources, it would be a rather apt and an even powerful illustration of how Russia's military intervention inside of Syria, focused on an indiscriminate bombing of Syrian opposition targets, has worsened the sectarian conflict there. That you see, at least according to these reports, Iranians racing to Syria to take up arms and join in the fight. That is not good news for the Russians.
Yemeni and Gulf Arab forces have seized control of the Arabian side of the strategic Bab al-Mandab Strait from Houthi fighters. Now, the strait links the Red Sea to the Gulf of Aden. The war, which has been going on now for 6 months there, has raised fears regarding securing oil supplies through Bab al-Mandab. The strait is the main thoroughfare for vessels whose destination is Europe or the United States. Now, according to the United Nations, the war has killed more than 5,400 people so far. And there have been more developments in the latest mass shooting in the United States that has claimed the lives of at least 10 people. Survivors there have recounted that the gunman, identified as Chris Harper Mercer in the state of Oregon, demanded to know if his victims were Christians. One victim who relayed her account with Mercer said that after he found out the person was a Christian, he told them that they would be seeing God in, quote, just about 1 second before them.
The gunman shot her. I did not see the gunman, but I witnessed her getting shot. And so at this point, you know, everyone's everyone's more panicked as it is already. And so we get her inside because the door was slightly open, and we still hear gunshots even when this is going on. We pull the lady in, doing CPR on her.
Portugal will hold its national elections this Sunday. The economy is stronger than 4 years ago, but there has been a cost because of the austerity measures implemented by Prime Minister Pedro Passos Coelho's government. For the average citizen, this has meant the loss of jobs, eviction, and pay cuts. The latest polls show that neither side obtains a majority in Parliament. However, Pasos Coelho would be the first European leader to be re-elected from a failed country if he wins. Now, many people around the world might argue their favorite sport is sort of like a religion, but France, some people in France have taken that meaning to a new level. Now, located in the small town in the south of France, a chapel has been dedicated to the sport of rugby. And what would you expect to find in a chapel like this? Well, there's no saints or icons, but there's rather hundreds of jerseys displayed from around the world. Now, it all started in 1964 after 3 prominent rugby players died in a car accident. The then abbot convinced religious authorities and the rugby world to dedicate a chapel to dead players and their teams. Since 1967, a mass is celebrated annually on Easter Monday. Mexico City is considered to be the capital of museums, with more than 180 of them dotting the city. Now, the megapolis is home to a new addition, the Cuatro Caminos Photo Museum, which not only is providing an exclusive space for Mexico's visual producers, but also a space of education and reflection on the contemporary reality of the country. Check it out.
With 200 visual producers, 398 photographs, and 86 videos, this may look like a high-end gallery, but in fact, it is Mexico City's newly inaugurated photo museum. Located in a working-class neighborhood, the Cuatro Caminos Museum seeks to do more than exhibit photos.
The intention of creating the space was for education, fundamentally for education, through exhibits, workshops, conferences, events, master classes, and everything else that has to do with the image.
With entry costing at about $1.77 and half that for students, the museum, founded by the well-known contemporary photographer Pedro Meyer, also seeks to celebrate the ever-evolving work of Mexico's visual producers.
What importance would I give it? Well, there are ways of learning about history and ways of interpreting reality. And finally, photography is one of them.
One tendency the curators realized when organizing the inaugural exhibit was the underlying theme of violence in Mexico. Called The State of Things, the collection of work graphically expresses the country's ongoing human rights crisis. The proposal of one participating photographer is to confront the apparent normalcy of violence in the collective mindset.
There has been a public that has been educated to consume these types of images for many years. What I want to do with my photos is to produce a reflection on the violence.
Meanwhile, another of the authors believes that one of the fundamental roles of social photography is to provoke reflection and action, to communicate ideas through the image.
The feeling that a photo can encapsulate can be very strong, and obviously will not simply stay in where the photo is taken. Everyone will see it for the explosion of action and feeling.
With the ever-proliferation of the consumption and production of images through new technologies, the organizers of the Cuatro Caminos Museum hope to maintain a relevant node of reflection and analysis of not just images, but of their meanings and interpretations. Clayton Cantelosur, Mexico City.
And that's what we're covering on this Friday midday from Caracas. Plenty more on our website, telesurtv.net/English. Reagan Devines with you this evening with the latest headlines for myself and for Telesur English. I'm Cody Weddle. Have a great Friday.